What's up, everyone? How's it going? Welcome back to another crit of Maxon. Welcome back to the Maxon and the Maxon Training Team YouTube channel. I hope you're all having a good Wednesday. It's good to be back. We had a little two-parter this week. So those of you who are in the stream yesterday will know that we actually did the Cinema 4D sort of animating side of things yesterday. And then last week, Ian showed us how to model inside of ZBrush, how to model this particular perfume bottle. And yeah, today we're going to be covering probably my favorite stuff to talk about. So this is definitely my favorite stream. All things to do with Redshift. And so we kind of titled this product lighting and texturing for whether it's product, perfume ads, etc. But it's mostly going to be a guide to glass and refraction and stuff like that. I get asked a lot about this. And so that was kind of one of the reasons why we chose to put together a perfume ad series. So we could really dive into talking about glass, refraction, and the kind of things and kind of rules we need to look at just to make something look really, really great inside of Redshift. So what I'm actually going to do, what we'll do later is we'll link to the other sessions and I'll show you where you can find them on the Maxon Trainer Team YouTube channel. But for now, don't forget in the description of this video, there are actually some project files. So there are 4 project files for Cinema 4D and Redshift. So everything is lit and textured, exactly kind of this kind of stuff we're going to look at today. So feel free to grab those. There is also something called streamfile_redshift. And that is this file here, which is kind of like a starting version of that first shot. And this is kind of what we're going to work on today is this particular shot here and kind of going through the different techniques that we need. For anyone who's not seen the final, I'm just going to really quickly play it for you and then we will dive in. Cool, so that's the final. So we're going to cover a whole bunch of topics today. Everything from looking at nested dielectrics, which is effectively a technique used within 3D to handle situations where we have transparent or refractive objects like glass with liquids, and they're placed inside other sort of transparent and refractive objects, creating this sort of series of complex refractive experiences happening together. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We're also going to talk a little bit about lighting, but it's relatively simple, the lighting setup for these shots. And then we're going to dive into looking at OpenPBR materials, so creating the glass for the bottle and then the liquid. Little things like surface tension, and then a very important topic, which is trace depths. And then we're going to look a little bit at optimization depending on the time, because I feel like it's an important topic to talk about. So also to hey everyone in the chat, hey to Raw, Brian, Phil, and Mr. Mandy, and to Shafi. How's it going, guys? Thank you for joining. As always, there is a chat section within YouTube. So if you have any questions for me, anything doesn't make sense, then feel free to just let me know. I'm on my own today, like I was yesterday, so I'll do my best to kind of be keeping an eye on the questions while we're going. Okay, cool. So there's obviously a lot of different things that we can talk about today. So we'll just be going through them at, you know, a relatively nice pace. But again, anything doesn't make sense, then just let me know. So we've already talked about nested dielectrics and what they are, and effectively, like, you know, it's a 3D technique. But the important thing here and the important rules that we have to abide by are when we are looking at a glass bottle. We don't even need the Redshift render view for this. When we're looking at a glass bottle with a liquid inside, so this could be anything. So we have our perfume bottle with our liquid. We could have a glass with, you know, with water inside of it or some kind of liquid inside of it. We then have to think about nested dielectrics and what we need to do in order to get accurate refractions. So that's what this is about. It's about accurate refractions. And so what we have to make sure is, let me just go to the glass bottle and let's X-ray this for us. So what we have to actually make sure is the glass itself. So actually, let's just solo everything. So let's solo. So the glass itself, it has to be double-sided. It has to have a thickness to it. So we have to have these outside faces, and we have to then have, let me come into here. We then have to have the inside. So we can see this is the thickness of my bottle. So what I can do is I can actually come all the way in here, and you can see I can come onto the inside of this bottle. So I'm now effectively, I'm now inside the glass itself. And so this is what we mean by saying we need to have double-sided geometry. And if I actually click one of these polygons, we can see that the inside polygons are actually, we're seeing the back of them here. So when we talked yesterday about reversing the normals, this is what we mean. On the inside of my bottle, we need to be able to see the back face of my polygons. And then if I then come into here, this is now the inside of the actual perfume bottle itself. So we're not talking about inside the thickness layer. We're talking about within the glass bottle. So we now have them facing outwards as we should. So if I kind of come out of here, we can see what we mean. So this is like the inside of here. And then of course we have the outside, which are naturally facing out. So this is a really important step when we're talking about working with accurate looking glass. This perfume bottle is double-sided. So what else we need to do, and this is a very, very important step. If we are working, like we said, with liquids within some type of glass, and this is going to seem really, really strange, but we have to make sure, if I just sort of, let's find an area, let's go on the inside here. We have to make sure our liquid, which is kind of this here, which we've cut off, remember? So if we go to our legacy ball, we have this here. Our liquid actually needs to be just slightly overlapping that inside layer of our glass. So we can see here, if I just come back to the inside, we can see this is our liquid. We've got our straw here, we've got our liquid, and we've got that inner layer, that first layer of our glass. And if I come to the outside, so this is the outer layer of the glass, and now we're within that glass thickness, we can see my liquid is overlapping. This is really, really, really important. And we should have some time later to, I'll show a comparison. Actually, you know what? Let's do that now. Let's show a comparison. So for speed, let's just grab this whiskey glass. And so this already is, it's a glass with a liquid inside of it that's sort of like already created for Redshift. Let's just throw in a HDR just for speed. Throw that in there. And then let's go to the Redshift render view. So this is a super fast setup, just so I can show you this. Okay, so this looks pretty good, pretty accurate. There's a few things we'd want to change, but for now, I'm going to leave it as it is. And so we can see that liquid goes all the way to the edge of the glass and around to the bottom. And this is looking accurate. And that's because the whiskey geometry is overlapping just that inside layer of that glass, just like we looked at. But if I come in and I just shrink this down, so this is now not overlapping and it's within the actual glass itself, we can see how different that looks. And so it might seem strange to be, deliberately creating overlapping geometry, but this is what we mean by nested dielectrics. And this is one of the rules that we absolutely have to abide by. And so if you find things aren't looking correct, make sure that you go into your liquid geometry and you have that overlapping. And it has to be overlapping in all directions. So this actually overlaps all around and even underneath. Okay, so that was sort of like a key thing that we needed to talk about. And that was, I came across this issue as I was sort of like working on this scene. And I had a little area that wasn't overlapping. So I couldn't quite figure it out, but I went through and I changed it and I made sure that every bit of that was overlapping as well. So let's throw in some lighting. We'll come back to our lights as we start to then build our materials, because we'll see how important they are and how much they work hand in hand together. But what we'll do is we're going to just be lighting this scene with a dome light and an area light. So that's all that we're going to use, but we're going to look at some little tricks inside of here as well. So let's take our dome light. And then within our asset browser, we have a bunch of HDRI studio setups that we can use. And these are really great because they create some really nice looking reflections and refractions within our glass. And so thinking about your HDRI in this case is going to be important because it's going to be quite visible within our shot. So let's just drag and drop that into the path. And we'll worry about the sort of the orientation and the rotation of this later on. For now, I'm not overly fussed about it. I'm going to create my materials and then we'll probably go back to our lights. We could even, if we wanted to, do a little bit of our rotation so we can see a bit more of the shadows on here. So we've added our dome light. We're sort of coming to here. Everything was relatively generic inside of here. But what we do want to make sure when we're working with glass, within our details tab on our lights, within our contribution, we have this affected by refraction. We have never, which means the rays won't be affected. We have auto and we have always. When working with glass, we do want to make sure that contribution is set to always. Be careful though, if you're working with extremely rough surfaces, this can override and cause some extra issues. So we're sort of talking about this in the context of nice clear glass right now. So we have our dome light. And what we can also do is we can then add a physical light or an area light. And this is going to help us bring out more details within our scene and actually help to bring out, you know, some more contrast and some more depth to our shot. So like I said, those finals were only rendered with a dome light and an area light. The rest of it and the rest of the kind of magic is within the texturing and some of the render settings. So if we take an area light, again, we just want to make sure we set those rays to always. And then let's just make this smaller. And the reason for this is because we have a relatively small shot. Let me just go back to our Redshift camera. Let's put that in here. And then because this is quite big and it's quite up close to my object, we might actually need to just reduce that intensity by quite a big amount. And we can even reduce the exposure. So the intensity is the intensity of the light. The exposure acts as a multiplier. So sometimes you might find you're putting that intensity really, really low. And if you can't go any further or we're getting to silly values, we could decrease that exposure as well. And something I want to talk about when working with area lights is a lot of the time people like to use softbox textures. This is going to soften the edges and create a bit more of a diffuse light. And on the original, I used one of the Grayscale Gorilla softboxes, but we can actually kind of create our own. And I thought for the sake of the stream, I'll just talk you through how you can create your own softbox inside of here. So if we just, within our area light, add a graph, we can actually, could even switch off the dome light here and just only have the area light lighting our scene. we can double click our node editor and we have this physical, this area light material here. And this is a really cool way of adding color. We can add gradients, we can create a fade in and out. But what we can do, you can actually create your own equivalent softbox by just using a few simple nodes. So the way that we can do this is we can take a ramp. So we just double click and we can take a ramp node. And within here, we have a few different map types. So we could do circular, and maybe we could just invert that gradient. Because remember, the white area will allow light through, the black area will effectively block the light, and anything grayscale will partially block the light. So we can connect this to our color, and now we've softened that image up a little bit nicely on here. So we have obviously different map types that you might be familiar with, but what I think is really cool is we can begin to sort of layer this up and play around with this by using a color layer. And our color layer is what I call baby Photoshop. We can combine multiple colors based on black and white or grayscale masks and based on our different blending modes. And so if we wanted to make this a little bit more interesting, we could grab a Maxon noise, we could connect that into our layer 1, and then we could just multiply these together. And so now we've created, if I just sort of reduce that mask a little bit so we don't see, those really heavy values, we've created effectively our own softbox here, which is procedural, and I can come into my ramp or my noise and I can play around with this a lot more. And if I just sort of call this softbox, if I just switch that one off, so this is what it looked like before. So we have this kind of just pure white area light with the same intensity everywhere, versus the softbox, which is just a little bit more of a diffuse and softer light. And this is quite an interesting technique. And a lot of people in, photo studios, photography studios, they use softboxes, they use cookies, which are gobos. And it allows us to just create some more interesting lighting that isn't, this same intensity all over. So we can create our own softbox effectively this way. Let's bring our dome light back on. And let's, for the sake of everyone on here, let's do a quick save. Okay, so let's quickly dive into the texturing side of things, because it's all well and good me talking about lighting, but we want to also be talking about glass. And at the moment, we don't really see much going on. And so before we do this, we've had a quick question from Nicole asking, sorry for the double question, can you confirm which way the normals are facing on the interior of the glass? So yes, I can. That is not a problem at all. So if I go to the glass bottle, let's just solo this. So on the outside, the ones facing us are going to be the correct way. So that's represented by that orange. On then what is, the inside of the bottle, but also correctly facing outwards, will be this correct way. But if we go on to the inside of the thickness, so we're inside the glass now, these should be the back of the polygons. So this is the way that we need to make sure we have these set up. And then the liquid, they all should be facing out. It should be correct, facing us. So I hope that helps. Okay, right. So let's get to some textures. So we're going to be working with OpenPBR textures here. But if you have any questions on, the other material types, the standard material, then the concepts are the same here. We can create these either as OpenPBR or as standard Redshift materials. So let's create an OpenPBR material, and we're going to call this glass for the perfume bottle. Let's stay organized. And we're just going to throw this or drag and drop this onto my glass bottle. So don't worry about this for now, this bit here. If we have some time, we'll talk a little bit about this. This is what I was playing with earlier. So we have this glass bottle on here. We have this material on here. And what we're going to do is we don't even really need to go into our node editor yet, but we can do if we want to. We're just going to be looking at the base properties of my material. And this material is relatively simple to set up. So if we're thinking about glass and we're thinking about refraction, we're talking about transmission. And we're also talking about IOR. Index of refraction is very, very important here. We want to make sure we're using the correct index of refraction. And you can Google this online. You can search, the IOR of glass, the IOR of water, all of those different things. And when we're talking about nested dielectrics, which in our case we do, we have this overlapping geometry. We do also want to make sure we have differing IOR values, which in our case we do. Glass is about 1.5, water or liquid, depending on what it is roughly 1.33. So we don't even need base color, but let's look at our IOR, which is correct. And we're also going to just set our roughness value to a very, very low value. We don't want it to be absolutely perfect. We don't want it to be 100% in one direction. So we'll just do a little 0.01. And then within our transmission, this is the most important section. We want to enable transmission. So we're now going to have a transmissive or a refractive material. And so now we're starting to see that we have some refraction going on. And then what we want to do, or we might want to, then look at our depth value or our color. So what color's doing is this color option here. So if I just change this color, let's do like a pink. What this color option is doing, when depth is set to 0, it's just tinting the refractions in a non-physical way. So it's just saying all the refractions, so all the rays that are being refracted within this glass material, please can you tint them pink? That's why it doesn't matter how thin or thick the object is, they're all going to be tinted pink. If you want to start creating some realistic glass or some realistic transmissive materials that have an element of thickness, this is where we want to play with this depth value. So we can then say in centimeters, how far this color is now going to travel. And this is going to be our scatter color. So we could just pop that down there. And now we can kind of play around and we can go higher and higher. And you can see as we get higher, let's do a really high value. As we get higher, we're now creating a more realistic looking pinkish glass, which is now looking at the different varying thickness layers or values of our object. And so this is all well and good, but we don't want pink glass, right? So we're looking for a nice clear glass. So what we're going to do is, again, not necessarily do a 100% value. Let's just do a 98% or a 0.98. So we're almost perfect white. Let's put our scatter back on to black and let's drop that down. So we could have no depth value. Again, the concepts are the same. Or what we can do is we can look at adding a depth value inside of here. And believe it or not, it might not be visible in the stream and it might also not be visible within your render view, but I did 2 separate tests, one with depth and one without, and you do actually see a difference within your refractions and within your reflections. So the depth for realism is actually quite an important step here. Okay, so we're getting a bit closer. Things aren't looking too great, but it's okay. We still have a lot more steps that we need to talk about in order to create this to look really, really nice. What we are going to do is let's create the liquid as well. And then we'll talk about some of the things that we need to do in order to make this look a hell of a lot better than it looks right now. So we'll leave this like this. And then what we'll do is we'll also create another OpenPBR. And this is going to be our liquid for our perfume. So let's make sure our liquid goes onto our legacy ball. So remember, this is what's creating our liquid now. And we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to come in. We're going to make that roughness 0.01, or in our case, we could go 0, but let's do 0.01. Our IOR this time, we're talking about liquid, is going to be 1.33. So our glass was 1.4 and our liquid is now 1.33. And again, we can go into transmission and we can increase the transmission, that weight value inside of here. And then what we can do is I might even just steal the colors of the original liquid. So this is the color that you want that liquid to be. So let me just copy that, just so I don't have to worry about finding that again. I'm going to paste that in here. And you're probably thinking, Ellie, it's looking strange. It's looking really weird. And you're right, it is. But that's okay. It's expected. And so the reason this looks a little bit strange is because of our trace steps. And so it's hard at this point to really be, perfecting how my glass and how my liquid is looking because of my trace steps. And so let's talk about those. Let's dive into that. Before we worry about going to here, because I could be looking at my render view thinking, oh, I really need to, fix my material or fix my lighting, when really it's neither of those things at the moment that are causing this to not look as it should. And so in my render settings, under globals, so under my Redshift advanced, so we'll talk a little bit about, some of these different settings throughout this live stream, but this is the most important one. Trace steps. Trace steps are the individual bounces for different ray types: reflection, refraction, volume, and transparency. And combined is the combined number of trace steps. So we have to make sure if we are increasing our trace steps, which in this case we need to, the defaults are not good enough, and we'll see that. I'll show you an actual representation. And so if we're increasing those, we also need to increase the combined. So keep an eye on here. So let's even, for fun, let's do a snapshot. This one here. Let's take a snapshot. And let's hit save just for fun. And so in my combined, I'm going to put it down to 0, just so I can really show you exactly what this is doing. So we have 0 combined trace steps. So it doesn't matter how high I go with these now, we can see it's not doing anything. And so as I increase my combined, you'll be able to see how this changes how my refractive and my reflective materials are looking. So if we go through, we can see as we increase, we're getting more and more of that refractive ray bouncing. And so now what's happened is we're no longer getting an improved looking refraction. And so this is now where we need to come into our individual trace steps and then begin to increase these. And so now we're seeing more and more within here. And so let's just put my combined up to a silly number, just so we can begin to work with this. And so you can see as I'm increasing this, we can see how this is looking far better than it was looking before. So that's because what we need to allow for is the individual number of bounces. And so what's happening is as a ray comes in, it needs to go through this first layer. It needs to then go through into this second layer, then into the liquid. And then what actually happens is the cap and the straw. So let's just throw these on here as well. And we may as well throw the lid on there. So the cap and the straw also are then refractive materials. So it then has to go through that layer, and then it needs to come all the way back at the other side of all of those layers. And so if we don't allow for that many refractive bounces, we're not going to be allowed to, you know, see that realistically within our refraction. So then what we can do, we can come back into here and we can sort of say, okay, let's go to 18 and let's come into our combined until we don't see any changes inside of here. So let's maybe just put that on to 20. And so now we can see that is looking far better. Also, hello to Ian, who's joined us in the chat. How's it going, Ian? So let's go back into our liquid and let's take a little look inside of here. So again, what we'll want to do is we want to make sure that we have this depth value as well in order to create that better looking liquid. So we could even drop that down to maybe a 2. So remember, this is in the centimeters. This is in centimeters because we're in C4D. If you're in a different DCC, it will be whatever the units are of your DCC. And so from here, what we can do is we can now look at that dome light, and we're probably thinking the lighting is looking a little bit off now. So let's maybe go into our dome light and let's maybe just rotate this a little bit round so we can start to get some better looking glass and reflections. So for now, let's leave it like this. So we have our glass. We have our glass that's looking a little bit something like this, and we've created our liquid that again has that different IOR and has those transmission values inside of here. And the most important thing we did was we changed our trace depths. Something I do want to talk about really quickly, actually, is you can do trace depths and optimization on a per material basis. So within our glass or within our any material, you can go to Redshift optimization and you can actually do a local override for your reflection and transmission trace depths. And this will override your local ones. And so you're probably thinking, like, why would we use this? Well, you might have some objects that don't need the high number of trace depths like this. And so in this case, what we can do is we could override our trace depths here, and we could make sure we're just increasing them on a local basis. And this works really well for optimization. Okay. Okay, cool. So we've talked a little bit about these two different materials. And now let's talk about something else that helps sell this liquid. So yesterday we looked at how we can make it stay level. Today we looked at how we can sort of render it and make it look a little bit nicer. We looked at our trace depths and our index of refraction. But what we also might have to do, and what we'll do in this case, is if I sort of come a little bit closer, if I come to here, we can see, if I try and get this like really flat, we can see that this liquid is kind of perfectly flat, right? And so in our case, we have something called surface tension. And that's when there is this little kind of edge bevel on our liquid inside of our object. And this can be done in various different ways. You could model that bevel yourself. Or what you could do is we can do it in a procedural way using a Cinema 4D node. And then we can also create that beveling using a Redshift node. And so I found this a really, nice technique that worked with this liquid move. So let's dive into how we can actually do that. And what we're going to do is actually within this setup here, let's just turn this off for now. We're going to use a node, and I think it's select facing. Here we go. We're going to use a node operator, which is called select facing. I'm going to make it a child of the liquid null. So it's looking at this entire setup as a whole. And what we can do is we can use this node to actually create our own polygon selection, which we can then apply a second material to, which has that bevel on. So what we want is we want the positive Y facing polygons, and we want to call this surface tension. And so now what we've done is we've created our own polygon selection tag. And so we have this liquid perfume, and then we can create a second option. So just for sakes of this, just so we can show you this, we can then drag that onto here. And the same way that you use material selections and polygon selections, we can drag that surface tension into there. And you can now see we have this material on top, and this material is the normal material inside. So let's bring this back and do this. And what we're going to do, we're going to call this surface tension. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the round corners node. And what this does is normally, or traditionally, it's used to round and bevel the corners of our geometry. And what it's going to do is it's then going to, if I just go to geometry and bump map, it's going to create this little rounding edge here. If we just set this to a slightly smaller value, we now have this little rounding happening on here, and it's creating that false version of that surface tension. Okay, right, so let's come back into here. And so we're getting a little bit closer. It's looking a little bit better than it did at the beginning. And again, that's just down to our dome light, our softbox, and those nice materials that we have just set up. So there is another thing I want to talk about. And that was a little bit of a trick that Adrian, one of the developers, showed me. And it talks about using real geometry to create more realistic refractive ray bending. So if I had this perfume bottle in an entire environment, an entire scene, the refractions and the reflections would look better because of that real geometry within my scene. So of course the dome light is only doing so much. What we can do is we can actually do a bit of a hack version of this with a cube and a material. So this will work to not only increase the look of our refractions, but it can also then work to apply a background color. And that's exactly what I did in that final animation. So what we can do is we can create a cube, which is now going around the entire scene. So we can see everything is within this little area, okay? At the moment, it looks a little bit strange, but that's okay. We have to trust the process here. And what we can do is let's just create a standard material. Why not? And let's throw that on my cube. And this is going to become my cube HDRI / background. That's what this is going to work as. And this is going to be the same thing, cube HDRI / background. And within my cube, we're going to do a similar technique that we looked at for the softbox. We're just going to apply a ramp, and we're going to create our own gradient, and we're going to use that to almost be lighting our scene And again, helping to improve those refractive rays and the look of our glass. So the idea here is this is a trick to, again, create better looking glass. And it also is going to work to create a background color. And we'll look at doing the equivalent with a dome light and a plane as well, so I can show you why this is such a cool technique. So let's take a ramp. And then let's just make sure this is set to linear. And then what we're going to do is a little bit like this. So we're going to go black to white to black, right? And we actually don't need this standard material. And that's because this can plug straight into the surface. And so by plugging straight into the surface, this now effectively becomes an incandescent material. And what we can do, we can duplicate the ramp, right? And I'm going to show you really quickly how we can create a rectangle gradient. So take one ramp that we just set up, vertical, black to white to black. And then this one is going to be horizontal, black to white to black. And then all we need is our color layer. And our color layer, as we know, we can combine multiple textures together or multiple colors together. So if I just plug this in and plug this in and we can multiply them together, we now create a rectangle gradient, which we can now connect in here. And so we can now see that we're getting, if I sort of switch this off and switch this on, we're getting that nice sort of like refractive rays and those refractive gradients within our glass, and it helps to just make those refractive areas look better and sort of give that element of accuracy and realism. And then if you wanted to add a background color, then that is not a problem at all, because all we have to do is go into here. Let's maybe find this color. This might be a little bit too dark, so let's go lighter with this color and lighter again. We could just create a background color this way by applying a color on one of those white knots. And so we can now create that nice background. Okay. So don't forget, if you have any questions for me, to let me know in the chat. And yeah, we can answer those as much as possible. So let's go back into my liquid. What do we want to do on here? So let's go back to that depth value, perhaps of 3. And so again, what that's going to do is it's going to allow the light to pass through it more, makes it look thinner. And so now this is what we have. This is what we have going on. So, you know, we're getting a little bit closer to that final. At any point we can come into our dome light. So really the dome light is very, very powerful here. And we can use it to really change those reflections. But there's something that I haven't done. And that is on my cube at the moment, we have got it lighting our scene and we've got it helping with those refractive rays, but it's also geometry in our scene that is casting shadows, but we don't want it to be casting any shadows. We just want it to be doing those other things that we want with the refraction and with the background and with the additional lighting. So what we can do is we can just add the Redshift object tag, and under visibility, we can actually prevent it from casting or creating or receiving any shadows. And you can really see how this looks now. And so now if I switch that off and switch that on, it really is starting to create that nice, clear, polished looking glass. Okay, so just to go through some of these questions, Sheffy was wondering, please can you repeat the select facing in a more simple way to understand? Absolutely, that is not a problem at all. So if I grab a cube what we can do is, I don't even know, do I need to make it editable? Let's see. Let's figure that out. And so our node is select facing. So if I drag and drop this onto my cube, think of it a little bit like a deformer. And what it does is it allows me to select the facing polygons on a particular axis. So if I select the plus Y, so think about it, we've got the Y-axis, right? So we've got that green one going up and down is Y. We've got the Z or the Z, which is that blue one. And then we've got the red, which is the X. So if I kind of go like this, we can see it a bit better, right? So positive Y, the positive Y face of this cube is this top one. Negative Y face is this bottom one. So if I say, okay, I want this positive Y face as a selection called, in our case, we called it surface tension, but let's just call it top, right? By naming it, we now get a polygon selection, okay? So now if I create a material, so let's just create one that is black on the cube, and then we'll create one that is red on the cube. And then we just put our top selection in there. So just like when we create any kind of polygon or edge selection, we can use that within our materials. We can use that within our material selection tag. And so now all this is doing is it's allowing me to define this face without actually having to make anything editable. So this is on a procedural cube or a primitive shape, right? We haven't had to make it editable. We haven't had to select any kind of polygons. So we can do this. And I think I could even go to that. Yeah, cool. So if I'm like, hang on a minute, I want positive X, or I want the positive Z, which will be hello over here. Yes, so select facing. So yeah, that's a simplified version of how to do that. Hopefully that helps. Okay, so let's cut back into Redshift. And let's talk about some other things that we can do. So this is where we're at the moment. Again, you know, like we said, we could probably go into the dome light and rotate it a little bit to get maybe a nicer looking reflections. But for the sakes of this stream and for the sakes of the fact it is almost 10 to, we will leave it as it is. But the next step of this sort of technique here, and when we're talking about glass, is micro surface imperfections. So within the real world, as we all know, everything has an element of roughness, element of specular or reflection. And that is going to help us here. So even though I know we want this to look really polished, and your client will say to you, we want it to be, you know, clean, 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 no marks, no anything, that's fine. But we can still do these tiny little micro details that won't make it look, you know, we're not talking about making it look dirty. We're not talking about fingerprints. We're talking about tiny little details that help. And this was a tip that I picked up from Ross Mason, watching his IBC presentation. I believe it was last year in Amsterdam. And so what we can do, if we go to our glass bottle here, at the moment, we've set our roughness to 0.01. So this is already on the right sort of lines. We're not going absolutely perfect. What we could do is we could create maybe a Maxon noise, or take some of the surface imperfections from inside of the asset browser, and we can create our own element of roughness. And what we can do is we can create a Maxon noise, and we can also create some varying displacement detail. And so if I just solo this Maxon noise, and so what this is going to do, it's going to break up our reflections. And so let's do a really low scale, and then let's stretch these along a little bit. And so let's go to our displacement node. So this is what we're doing. We're setting up some displacement, so noise and displacement. I'm just going to use this, like we said, to break up our reflections. So everything's going to go wild. That's absolutely fine. This is because we have auto displacement. And then what we can do, where do I need to go to? I need to go to the glass bottle. I'm actually going to go back and use the Redshift object tag. And this is going to give me more control over my displacement and my tessellation, which is my subdivisions. So also, yes, to what Sophie is saying, like how it looked then, I agree. I think it looks pretty cool. This is like, I'd pick this up if I was in the shop as a perfume bottle. So we can override our geometry, we can enable our tessellation, we can actually increase some of the subdivisions and the smoothing of our geometry. Again, this will help our reflections and refractions, specifically our refractions, looking smoother within the thickness of the bottle. And then we can bring back some displacement. And again, here you go, Sophia, this is this one's for you. But what we're going to do, we're actually going to make it a lot smaller. And so we've brought back this displacement. And at the moment, we have a scale of 1 centimeter. So these values are in centimeters. And so let's just go maybe to 0.01. And what we can do is let's come back into here and let's find, oh no, we need to find it now. S, the magic S key to come back into here. And so if we kind of sort of come into here, what this is doing is it's actually doing the slightest bit of breaking up our reflections. So if you keep an eye on here, if I set this to 0, we get really, really smooth, a really smooth line here. But if I do maybe 0.02, it starts to break these up. And this might, again, be a little bit too much. This might also be too much, but we could come in and we can just dial in and tweak this and get some really slight imperfections in here. And this would be the same for if we're looking at, you know, our roughness. We'd want to do really low values so we don't see a really intense change. And so let's leave that for now. But again, you know, micro surface details is what we'd perhaps want to be looking at. So let me just go through a few of these questions. There are a few more things we want to talk about. So when rendering glass for comp, do you usually use alpha for background or just leave it in? So unfortunately, I don't do a lot of compositing, so I don't necessarily mess with this. But next week, Max is going to be diving into color grading and diving into Red Giant, so a little bit more of the compositing side of things. So what I can do is I'll ask him his tips and advice of what he recommends, and we will dive into that one for next week. So if I was wondering, would you recommend using caustics in this example, or is it too expensive? This is a great question, and it's a great topic to talk about because, yes, caustics do help with an element of realism, definitely. But like you said, they can be more expensive to render. So it depends on the importance of them. A lot of the time, if you have a flat surface, so caustics is when the light travels through and then you get that nice light pattern on that color. In this case, I don't know how different they would be. I rendered without caustics mainly because I liked how it looked without. So that's the key thing. I liked how it looked without them. And so I was able to save render time and not worry about caustics. But if this was on a table and I wanted, you know, to be able to see as the light comes through those caustics, it may come down to actually needing to do them to help with the realism. So it's a lot about the shot that you're creating. And in this case, the caustics, setting them up would be very, very simple. Because I'm using a dome light and an area light, large environment lights work really well with brute force caustics. All I'd need to do is come into my caustics and enable them. So brute force caustics, really nice and simple to use. They just require a dome light or a very, very big area light, so we can switch those on. If we want more clean and accurate looking caustics, then photon caustics is the way to go. But then you need to make sure you have really small point and directional lights to help and create those caustics. So hopefully that helps. So TJ was wondering about how does the dome light still affect the bottle now the cube is in between the dome and the bottle. So yeah, this is because we added the Redshift object tag. And so that dome light is still casting and creating reflections in our scene. Let's just sort of speed through a few of these. So Shafi is wondering, as the liquid is animating, will the Maxon noise be moving too? So there's no Maxon noise on the liquid. But if the bottle is moving, then yes, we do have to make sure that when it comes to the Maxon noise, we use the world mode to make sure, or we can UV our bottle and then it will be fine and it will stick. So that might be something that we look at now. Okay, cool. So any other questions, feel free to let me know, but we will move on. So for now, what we've done is we've taken a look at the lighting side of things. We created, remember, that dome light, the area light. We looked at the softbox. We then looked at that cube, which is our kind of fake HDRI background that helps create the more accurate and some nicer refractions within our glass. We looked at our OpenPBR materials. And so that is the recommendation, is to be using OpenPBR materials. You can use standard Redshift materials. The concepts are relatively similar: transmission, depth, and color, and IOR. Those are the things that you need to change. You can even go into the asset browser and you can go glass and go to materials. And there's a bunch of glass in there that is pre-made for Redshift, or liquid. And we have pre-made liquid assets as well that you can use for your scenes. So if you don't want to worry about building it from scratch, dive into the asset browser. Okay, so I want to talk about something else that I did. So let's go to here. So you're probably thinking there's some lettering on here. And this actually, I did this a very lazy way. So we're going to do it the correct way on the live stream. And so what I did was I created a UV. And so you can see actually we have it on all of the different layers of my glass. So this is actually, like, if we now you know, you're going to notice. And it's not ideal. We don't normally want this. Chances are you probably want it on one face of the glass and at most the two outer faces. But this is all four faces of the glass have this kind of embossing on, because I was lazy. But we're not going to be lazy on the live stream. We're going to do it properly. So I'm going to show you how we can do this and how we can create our own embossed lettering for our models. So let's take the glass bottle and let's bring it into a whole new scene. And let's just get rid of all of these. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to our UV edit mode. Hello, there we go, UV edit mode. And we're going to, so we deleted the UV tag, the original UV tag we deleted. Don't need it anymore, we're going to make our own. And we're going to go set UV from projection. And then under automatic UV, so disclaimer, I don't do a lot of UVing, but I do a lot of automatic UVing because it's great. You know, it's handy for moments and situations like this. And so I'm going to do a cubic unwrap. Am I going to do a cubic unwrap? Or we're going to do a packed unwrap. Let's try this again. Why is this not working correctly? Let's try this again. Right, give me my glass bottle. Oh, I had a face selected. Did I have a face selected? Set UV and cubic. There we go. I had a face selected. That's why it was looking really strange. So set UV from projection, make sure everything isn't selected. And then we do a cubic unwrap. And the reason for this is because all I want to do is I want to add that lettering to the front of here. So automatic UV unwrapping is not a one-click solution, but it is for things like this. So I can see this is sort of the way it's unwrapped is this is the back face, and you can see the white lines are the seams that it's tried to create for us. And they're not great, they're not perfect, but they're okay for what we need. And so this here, this is our front face. We can kind of see it. We can see this here. And so I know I can actually add some lettering or create my own texture for this section here. And the way that we do that, something I talk about quite a lot in my streams, is we go File, New Texture, and let's call this Perfume Bottle UV. And I think I've made this a few times, so let's go. Oh, let's do live demo. So we can change the resolution. Let's just do 4K because why not? And then we can go to Layer, Create UV Mesh Layer. What it does is it looks at the UV and it creates a wireframe template on my texture. And then what we do, we go to File, Save Texture As, and because I use Photoshop, it's where I'm my most comfortable. I'm going to choose a PSD file and I'm going to say OK. And let's Perfume Bottle UV Live Demo, save that, and let's go find it. Hide my unorganized files on my other screen. Live stream, we save that under Stuff for Stream. Nice. And then we're going to open that with Photoshop. Okay, so let's bring this over so you guys can see it. This is what we just created. So we effectively have that background color that we made. And what we can do with this is we can make it black. And then we have our UV mesh layer. So that's that wireframe that we created when we created that UV mesh layer. And it's just really handy for us to be able to see, you know, the area that we might want to add that text to. And so what we can do is I actually think I created one. This one, let's do the other one. UV recovered. Okay, they're basically the same thing. So let's go and create this. Let's bring this in. And what we're going to call this, should we call this, let's call this golden. Let's call it golden. Because it's a little bit more of a gold sort of theme, isn't it? And I can place this sort of roughly where I think that embossing is, but it's okay because we can adjust this within Redshift. So let's set this, let's bring this out and let's set this to a mid-gray. And the important thing we want to do now is in order to create that nice smooth embossing, we actually want to make sure that we blur the edges of our text or of our label. And so we're going to get that smooth displacement on top of here. So the way that we do that really easily is we just throw on a Gaussian blur, definitely not that high. Let's maybe do something like a 4.3. So this is what we've got going on here. And now this is what we have. So we've created this texture layer and we're going to go File, Save As, and let me just save that as a PNG. So we have our PNG, and now we can come back. We can call this UV'd, our glass bottle UV'd, and we want to make sure we bring it into our original scene. So let's paste this in here. Glass bottle, so you can see what we did here, this one. Let's throw on that Redshift object tag, and let's throw on that glass. And now we can come into Redshift, go back to our render view. And then what we can do, we can now go back into that glass texture. So this is a glass texture on here. And we can use that UV that we just created. So it looks like this. I'm going to show you how it looks. Let's double click this. If it wants to open for me, here we go. This is how it looks. Not very interesting, but when we apply it with displacement, it's going to look pretty cool. So let's add some displacement again, plug that into here, and then plug that into our displacement. And now we can see we have that golden on top of here. And so we can kind of see that it's slightly offset. And that's fine. We could have done it a bit more accurately inside of Photoshop, but in our case, it is not the end of the world, because we can just come in to our offset. And if my brain would work, I can do minus 0.2. So maybe 0.02. And now we're sort of moving this up a little bit. And then what we can do is we can make sure our scale is just a lot smaller. And so if I come out of here, we can see we've created this embossing purely by doing a very quick auto unwrap, throwing it into Photoshop, creating our text or creating that layer or that label that we wanted. And then we bring it back in and then we use it as a displacement texture. If we wanted it to go in, so get embossed inwards, let's do a -1. And so now it goes onto the inside of our object. But now you're probably thinking, but Ellie, we're now losing this displacement. But don't worry, because we have the ability to do displacement blending. And so what we can do is we can just combine both our displacements inside of our displacement blender, connect that into the displacement, and then we just need to make sure that we add the weight value for all of our displacements. We can put that onto a value of 1. And now we're going to have, if we add them together, we get an additive mode. So we're going to have the Maxon noise displacement and something like this. Okay, so let's take a little look at how this is looking. So it's looking pretty close to that final. You know, we've created those textures. And so if we want to go back and do again a really, really quick recap, we looked at the lighting, which for us is, let's just get rid of the dome light, switch those off. Let's just save everything. We have our dome light here that is just basically the default. We've played around with the rotation to get those nice reflections. And so this already is actually looking pretty cool. We then added a extra key light with a little bit of a softbox. So this can look to bring out some highlights of our surface imperfections. We could use it to bring out some more of the detail on the lid and just like bring up some of those shadows. We then used that cube over the top to create some additional refractions and some more accurate ray bending, because we have that geometry, and we could also use it to create a nice background just like this. We then looked at OpenPBR materials. So we looked at the glass and the liquid, where we looked at transmission. And again, we looked at the difference of IORs, which is important for our nested dielectrics. And we just added some micro details on the glass as well. And we looked at that surface tension with that select facing. So I guess the natural thing to kind of round up, let me just double check my notes. The natural thing to round up, oh, and of course we looked at our tray steps. You know, don't forget probably the most important step that you would want to do at the beginning of your lighting and texturing for anything to do with glass. And so the natural thing now would be to talk about the rendering side of things. And this is, again, something I get asked about a lot. And I got asked about a lot whilst I was doing this animation. Obviously, rendering animation with glass takes time. That's the way it is. Glass and refraction does take a fair bit of time to render. And especially because we've increased our trace depths, which in this case we've had to do. But a lot of the time when it comes to glass, all of the things that we're doing to improve the accuracy and the realism and the look of the glass is, like we said, to improve the quality of the look of our render. And so what we don't want to do is we don't want to do anything that's going to negatively affect the quality of our render or the quality of how this looks. And the reason for that is because why have we gone to all of this trouble and all of this effort to create realism and nice looking refractions if we're just going to, you know, cut all that quality when we render? And so I'm a big fan of manual sampling and optimization inside of Redshift. And so what that is within our sampling inside of Redshift, by default, we have automatic sampling and we have a threshold, which defines the quality of our render. So if we go into the basic tab, this is what I mean. We have this bucket quality and we have this threshold. This is really, really great, especially if you're new, if you're first learning Redshift, or just don't really have a lot of time to worry about optimization, or if you have endless time to render, then this is fine. This is absolutely fine. But if you want to start looking at production and look at speeding up your render times, it then comes down to optimization, and that comes down to manual sampling. So if I just switch this off, what happens when I switch that off is we get a few different options. So we get our min and max samples, and we get some local overrides here. And this is where we want to then begin thinking about the samples that we need in our scene. And I'm not going to spend a long time talking about this. And that's because I've actually already done an entire live stream that goes through the optimization workflow inside of Redshift. It looks at manual sampling, it looks at GI, it looks at, our local samples, and our globals and our trace depths. This is what it does. Bear in mind, this is relatively generic. So also bear in mind the other things that we've talked about today. But effectively what I did for this was, I'm just going to talk you through my settings and why I chose to do them. So we switched off automatic sampling. Believe it or not, I actually kept the threshold at 0.01. I actually rendered with a medium threshold, which was pretty good considering the quality of the render. We then want our minimum samples recommended is 16. This is really ideal for, majority of cases and majority of the standard materials inside of Redshift. And then our samples max, I set to 1024. And so samples max, all it's looking at is depth of field, motion blur, and anti-aliasing. That's all it's looking at here. So if you have heavy motion blur and heavy depth of field, increase your samples max. And what we're doing is we're looking at exponential values. So your 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, exponential values. Redshift fires rays out in 32 ray bundles, that's why. So we want to make sure we're hitting the next one. And then what I did was I looked at what was in my scene and I override those samples. So for me, I've got reflections and I've got refractions in my scene. So I need to say, okay, how many samples do I need for this? And because I do a lot of optimization and because I do a lot of sort of tests, I know that I need to have about 2048 samples in order to get a nice clean render. And this is talking about just the samples for reflection and refraction. We also want to make sure this is higher than the max values. So this is all I did for sampling. We had no motion blur. My globals were kept at roughly this. And then in my global illumination, I'm a big fan of brute force and Irradiance point cloud. We can increase that balance there. And then I like Irradiance point cloud. I think it's definitely a faster render. And there's some tricks that we can do with this. So again, brute force rays, similar to reflection and refraction. These are your GI rays. So if you have noise around the entirety of your scene, chances are you just need to up these. And again, I ended up with 2048. If you go back through the live stream that I just showed you, it will explain what exactly these are and why we choose to change them. But I just thought it would be helpful to show you what I ended up with. So we've got plenty of GI rays here. And then because I'm using Irradiance point cloud, so some of you might want to use brute force. It's nice, it's accurate. It's nice and it's accurate. It's slower because it fires a ray out per pixel. Irradiance point cloud will fire a ray every 16 by 16 pixels. So it's faster and it interpolates and blends between the two. What we can do is to make this more accurate is we can increase the retrace threshold. And this is exactly what I did. And what this does is it fires in the areas that need it, and the troubling and the difficult areas that need more brute force rays, it will fire them. We can also lower the screen radius as well. And then our bucket size, again, something I've talked about a lot, is just the size of the buckets. This is dependent on your GPU. And this is exactly what I ended up with on as my render settings. And I did a little bit of a comparison because I didn't want you guys to have to sit and watch me actually do a render. So here is a sort of visual representation of what we were just talking about. So this scene here uses automatic sampling and uses a brute force GI method. Looks very nice. You know, looks very clean, looks high quality, etc. And it took 8 minutes, 28 seconds to render. And the important thing is both of these scenes had the same resolution, had the same bucket quality, so that medium that we looked at, that threshold, has the same number of trace depths, and then GI was, what was GI? 5, I think. GI was 5. Has a hardware ray tracing on, and bucket size of 512, right? This one, and if you can spot the difference, please tell me. This uses manual sampling, and it's everything that we just talked about. Min and max samples, so hopefully these are visible for you all in the stream. Reflection, refraction, brute force rays were 2048, and then GI was brute force and irradiance point cloud, and we did that retrace threshold, and it took 2 minutes 49 seconds. Here's another comparison. This is something I just posted on my Instagram just to kind of mess with people a little bit. It's 2 different renders put together. Those are the 2 renders put together, and you really, really cannot tell the difference. And this is why I love talking about optimization, especially when we're talking about rendering glass and refraction. And Nicola was sort of saying like crazy render times, and am I rendering on a Mac? Yes, I'm rendering on an M3 Max MacBook Pro with, I don't know, 128 gig of RAM. I probably should know this. Yeah, 128 gig of RAM, something like that. There we go. Yeah, so as you can see, we can actually really heavily improve our render times. And this is something that I did because I knew I was going to be rendering out hundreds of frames to create this final animation, which we can just really quickly go through again once more. So yeah, would have taken a very long time if I hadn't looked at optimizing my scene. Cool, so let me just go through and see if there are any final questions. I know we've overrun, so I'm sure we're all shocked, I know. Let me just go through sort of some comments on no one wants to do UVs. I'm with you, yeah, but in this case, it's actually relatively simple, and we can use it to create some pretty cool effects. I do it a lot, just this method where I do an auto unwrap and I throw it into Photoshop and I create my own kind of textures. Cool, so some final stuff. Don't forget the project files are in the description of this video. Also, this will be uploaded onto the Maxon Trainer Team YouTube channel and timestamp thanks to the amazing Dr. Sassy. So if there's any stuff you want to go back through, then don't worry, it'll be uploaded on there. You can go back through it and you can then obviously flick through based on those great timestamps that he does. I also thought I would link to the older streams. So last week, Ian showed us how we can model this inside of ZBrush. And so if you head over to the chat, you should be able to find the link for that. And then yesterday, we looked at the motion design and the animation for this inside of C4D, which is then this link that I'm putting in now. And then next week, we'll have Max on, and he'll be diving into all things to do with color grading. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to render out a more flat color version. So not like the final here, which has just got a bit of a standard color pass from Magic Bullet Looks. He's going to do his own color grade and he's going to break that down for us, which is going to look very cool. And so on this topic, Nicola was saying, are the rest of the color changes due to color grading? So yes, this was just, I just went into After Effects, Red Giant, Magic Bullet Looks, and I found one of the LUTs, the sort of like free LUTs that they do within it, and I threw it on and did a couple of little tweaks to get it to a final look. But yeah, next week we'll have a really nice looking shot. And then talking about differences from when you are now versus the final render. Yeah, I will always do a little bit of post for a still that'll be inside of Photoshop, for a animation that'll be inside of After Effects, and it will be a really, really simple sort of maybe some hue, saturation levels, highlights, bit of exposure, and a bit of color grading inside of Magic Bullet Looks, just to bring up those final bits. Because I think sometimes inside of a render you can't always get it to perfect. I got it to a point where I was really happy with it, but then yeah, just wanted to do that final pass inside of there. Okay, brilliant, cool. So let's wrap this up. Thank you to everyone who joined live and for anyone who catches the recording. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for all the great questions as always. Don't forget to download the project files and don't forget to join us next week. If you have any questions for me, feel free to DM me on Instagram. I'm at itwaselly. Ask your questions, anything wrong with like project files. If you have any questions on anything to do with this that didn't make sense or doesn't work for your scenes, in particular optimization, then yeah, just drop me a message and let me know, and I'm here to help. So with that, I guess we'll wrap this up. Thanks again, everyone, and I will catch you next week. Bye.